Hey everybody, my name is Dr. Scott Giacomucci. I'm the director and founder of the Phoenix Center for Experiential Trauma Therapy in Media, Pennsylvania. I'm board certified in clinical social work, in psychodrama, and certified as a group psychotherapist, and my specialty is really in trauma and traumatic stress. I'm really happy you found this video, and I hope that you'll find it helpful in your work. So this video is a continuation of a video series to promote my newly published book, Social Work, Sociometry, and Psychodrama, Experiential Approaches for Group Therapists, Community Leaders, and Social Workers. This video will be focused on Chapter 3 of the book, which is titled History of Sociometry, Psychodrama, and Group Psychotherapy, and Jacob Moreno. So in this video, I'll be going through briefly some of the history of Moreno's methods and the history of Moreno himself, which of course is intertwined with the history of his methods. So in the previous video, we talked about some of the history of group psychotherapy. I want to revisit some of that history here as we talk about Moreno's history as well. So coincidentally or not, there seems to have been a group of specialists who all were focusing on group work about the same time in the beginning of the 1900s, who created different approaches to group work all around the same time. Many people credit Joseph Pratt as the founder of group therapy, based on his 1905 development of educational groups. Other people credit Trigant Burrow, the founder of group analysis, as the founder of group therapy, while others attribute Jacob Moreno as the founder of group therapy. Moreno was actually the first to use the terms group therapy and group psychotherapy, and was actually the only person using the terms between 1931 until 1935. Moreno argued that true group psychotherapy had to treat the group as the patient, rather than treating the group as a collection of individual patients. And that just like we start individual therapy, individual treatment with assessment, that in order to do true group therapy, we had to also start with group assessment. How could we offer interventions into groups if we don't first assess the underlying problems within that group? So this is where Moreno's sociometric system comes into play. He believed that true group therapy wasn't possible without group assessment methods, which is what he tried to create in his sociometric system. It's also important to note here that Moreno and Samuel Slavson had a bit of a rivalry. Slavson was another prominent group therapist. Samuel Slavson was more psychoanalytically oriented and created the American Group Psychotherapy Association within a year of Moreno founding the American Society of Group Psychotherapy and Psychodrama. These two organizations grew and developed with very different norms, very different requirements for participation and membership, and largely separated certification processes, academic journals, and philosophies to group work. Even to this day, they remain somewhat separated, although there are now many members, including myself, who are members in both organizations. So there's some disagreement, some controversy about who is considered the founder of group psychotherapy. You'll get different answers depending on who you ask that question to. So Jacob Moreno is who we'll be focusing on today as we're looking at the history of psychodrama and Moreno's methods. Moreno's group work goes back to 1913 or so, where he organized a group of sex workers in Vienna. And he later writes in his autobiography that they began to see through this work with the sex workers about how each individual in the group could become a therapeutic agent for everybody else in the group. He says that the potentialities of a group therapy on the reality level crystallized in our mind. So again, he's referring to working with a group as a whole, accessing mutual aid within the group, and each participant in the group being a therapeutic agent for each other. These are core aspects of Moreno's group psychotherapy. His original use of the term group therapy, interestingly, was used in a different context than how we usually use the term group therapy today. Moreno first used the term group therapy and group psychotherapy to describe his research and his interventions in Sing Sing prison, where he was doing sociometric tests, creating sociograms, and attempting to restructure the prison community based on his sociometric analysis. He was trying to reposition everybody in the prison, the inmates, based on their identity, based on their preferences, based on their personality, based on their past experiences. He hoped that through this type of restructuring of the community, that he could position the inmates to be therapeutic agents for each other. This was the original meaning of his group psychotherapy. Quite different than how we use the term today. Originally, for Moreno, it was more about community work. He argued that individual therapy was about psychodynamics, and so group therapy should be about the sociodynamics, the social forces, the multiplicity of relationships within the group, and that we should avoid doing individual therapy in a group setting, or individual therapy with a group audience. Moreno would not describe this as true group psychotherapy, but that we really had to treat the entire group as the patient, to work with the group as a whole. And so this is what sociometry does, this is what psychodrama does, this is what sociodrama does, this is what all of Moreno's methods do. Although it may look like we're doing individual therapy with a group audience in psychodrama, where the protagonist is the identified client, the topic and the protagonist is usually chosen sociometrically, meaning that the topic is representative of the group as a whole, and the protagonist becomes a mirror for everybody in the group to see themselves within the psychodrama. So, although it might look like individual therapy in a group setting, it's really a group as a whole approach, which gets further integrated in the sharing phase of the psychodrama. So, Moreno's work was really expansive, and it's hard to briefly summarize his timeline because he did so much in his life. He was born in 1889 in Romania and moved to Vienna in 1895 as a child with his family. They were refugees when they moved to Vienna. He ended up growing up in Vienna, and he founded, one of the first major things he did professionally was founding the Religion of the Encounter and the House of the Encounter. Quite similar to social work settlement houses, which were deeply influenced by religion and spirituality, which had core aspects of the arts and drama into the settlement house programs. Moreno's House of the Encounter welcomed immigrants and refugees from anywhere and connected them with each other, connected them with medical support, with legal support. Moreno writes that the first encounter groups took place in the House of the Encounter, and this is going back to around 1908. This was when Moreno was in his mystical phase, where he was studying world religions and philosophy. He adopted Jesus and Socrates as his two primary role models. And he began to develop his ideas about the Godhead, about every human being being godlike. Moreno views human nature as not just biological, psychological, social, or economical, but primarily human beings, first and foremost, are cosmic beings. And this idea, this philosophy, really influenced everything that Moreno did in his life. In the 1913, 1914 was when Moreno was experimenting with role-playing in the parks with children. In 1914, he publishes his famous poem, An Invitation to an Encounter, where he suggests that we should rip out our eyes and give them to someone else, and the other person would rip out their eyes, and we would take them on as our own, and that we would see through each other's eyes. We would step into each other's shoes. This was the foundation of Moreno's encounter philosophy, and really the concept of role reversal. Now, 1915 through 1918, Moreno worked as a medical officer in Mittendorf refugee camp. This is where he coined the term sociometry. He noticed that the camp had a number of different problems, and he believed that these problems were related to the structure of the camp. And he wrote a letter to the Minister of the Interior of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, suggesting that the problems of the camp could be solved by sociometric analysis. You can actually find a copy of this letter. It's written in German, but it's in the beginning pages of Who Shall Survive. This was where Moreno coins the term sociometry. The government didn't seem to pay much attention to his suggestion, and he didn't really get to implement his ideas until later. In 1917, he finishes his doctorate from the University of Vienna, and he goes on a year later to create the Diamond Journal, which included work from Martin Buber. Here we can see a connection between Moreno's encounter philosophy and Buber's ideal philosophy. There seems to be a connection here in that Moreno's work may have influenced Buber's work. Moreno then moves about an hour south of Vienna to a place called Bad Voslu, where he was the medical officer of the town. And he began working with the people. He developed a reputation as the wonder doctor because of his unconventional approaches. It was in Bad Voslu that he wrote the words of the Father, and he actually wrote them on the walls of his home at the time, and wrote them in a way where he describes he was inspired by the Godhead. And so the words of the Father is a deeply spiritual publication that outlines a lot of Moreno's mysticism, his ideas of everybody being God. It was just a year later, 1921, that the first psychodrama took place. Moreno describes April Fool's Day, April 1st, 1921, as the birthday of psychodrama. This is where he rented out the comedy hall in Vienna, and he had an audience of several hundred people, and he got on stage without a script, without actors, with just an empty chair. And this was a very chaotic and uncertain time for society in Vienna, in that the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was collapsing. And there was a lot of uncertainty about what was going to happen next, about who the next leader was going to be, about how things were going to change politically, socially, and culturally. Moreno offered up the empty chair to anyone from the audience that could step into the role of the new world, the new leader of the new world order, and to propose new ways, new ideas for how to lead the country and the society forward. He writes that this was a big failure, honestly, that he was critiqued in the newspapers. It really hurt his reputation in Vienna. And that although that session was a failure, that it was the beginning of the theater of spontaneity, where he began to experiment more with his ideas of spontaneous theater and role-playing. Looking back at it 100 years later, we could analyze it with everything we know now, with a well-formulated and developed psychodramatic theory. My hunch is that because Moreno hadn't developed his ideas about the warming up process and the canon of creativity back then, that one of the reasons why this was a failure could have been that he didn't focus enough on warming up the audience. They clearly were not expecting a spontaneous production. They were probably expecting to sit in the audience quietly and watch a scripted play. They were warmed up to something else. So just some of my ideas about why this first psychodrama may have been a failure. It was also the first use of the empty chair technique. Now, the theater of spontaneity that Moreno organized is where he began to do some research on his actors and how much time they spent speaking to one another, and the proximity, the distance between them on the stage as it related to emotional and social closeness. His ideas of sociometry were really influencing his projects and his behaviors at this time. He had created this vision of psychiatry or healing for society, what he called sociometry. And he believed that working individually was simply not enough, that a truly therapeutic procedure could have no less objective than all of humankind. This is where his motivation came for using the theater as an avenue for social change, for trying to create what he called a cultural revolution. He was deeply influenced by Aristotle's work and the idea of actor catharsis, audience catharsis. It was through the theater of spontaneity that he started to see that the actors were having catharsis too, which later developed into some of his psychodrama ideas. So all of this was still back in Vienna. It wasn't until 1925 Moreno immigrated to the United States, to New York. And he writes about having an unclear immigration status during his first couple years in the United States, and that he struggled to obtain his medical license and employment until he was granted citizenship based on a marriage. It seems that his first job, full-time employment in the United States, came a couple years after his immigration, where he became the director of social research for New York State Department of Social Welfare. And again, we can see a connection here between Moreno and the social work field. This is where he did his research in Sing Sing prison that I mentioned in the beginning of this video. And this is also where he did his famous research at the New York Training School for Girls, which became the foundation of his book, Who Shall Survive, and much of his sociometric theories. It wasn't until later, in 1936, that Moreno founds his mental health hospital, originally called Beacon Hill Sanitarium and later renamed Moreno Sanitarium. And it wasn't until the late 30s that he actually began developing psychodrama as a psychotherapy and as a clinical approach. So many people don't realize that psychodrama was really the last of Moreno's developments, the last of his creations, and that it was influenced by everything else that he did: his spiritual philosophy, the religion of the encounter, his vision of sociometry, the theater and the theater of spontaneity, and his sociometric system. All of this was the foundation for developing psychodrama as a psychotherapy. So, as he developed psychodrama as an approach, he began to train others after founding the Sociometric Institute and the Psychodramatic Institute in 1941. And shortly later, 1942, is when the American Society of Group Psychotherapy and Psychodrama was founded, the ASGPP, as we know it. A few years later, 1949, Zirka and Jacob Moreno marry. Zirka had originally came to the United States in 1941, seeking treatment for her sister from Dr. Moreno. The 1950s seemed to have been one of the most active times for psychodrama and for Moreno. Moreno was an adjunct professor in the universities in New York for 15 years or so. In the late 40s, he was actually nominated to be the chair of Harvard University's sociology department. In 1949, they dedicated a psychodrama stage at the psychology lab at Harvard University. Moreno was traveling all around the country, offering guest lectures in the late 1940s, the early 1950s, in dozens of universities. He was really trying to get word out about his methods. One historical author suggests that in the 1950s, 1/3 of all psychiatric hospitals at the time were using some form of psychodrama. That's 30%, 33% of all psychiatric hospitals at the time using psychodrama. It was a lot more than I would have expected. During this time, Moreno was traveling 6 months of the year, both Jacob and Zirka Moreno. 6 months of the year, they were traveling around the country and later around the world to teach psychodrama. By the 1970s, the psychodrama conferences, they had over 2,000 attendees. Psychodrama was particularly popular. In the early 1970s, there were a couple of different movements that incorporated and integrated Moreno's methods, for better or for worse. One of these movements was the human potential movement. Another one was the encounter movement, the T groups and sensitivity training, the therapeutic communities, all adopted aspects of Moreno's work. While these movements really popularized psychodrama interventions and techniques, they also separated Moreno's interventions from his philosophy and even from his name. And Moreno writes that these movements really cannibalized his work, that they made his interventions into something that they weren't intended to be. And they, in many ways, created a bad reputation for psychodrama. It was through the use of psychodramatic interventions in really ways that were not trauma-informed, that were harmful, that psychodrama began to develop a bad reputation. And these were being used by folks who didn't have proper training in psychodrama, proper supervision, and even by folks that didn't have a background in psychotherapy. They were using empty chair, using psychodrama and role-playing, even in things as explicitly harmful as what they called attack therapy. At the end of Moreno's life, he was really upset about how his methods had become disconnected from their philosophy, from their roots, and from him as the originator. It probably didn't help that he published his first 9 books anonymously, believing that that anonymity was the highest spiritual principle, and that when we create something, it couldn't belong to anybody. He later seems to have regretted that decision, as he did begin to put his name on his later books. In 1973, Moreno co-founded the International Association of Group Psychotherapy, what we call IAGP today. This was co-founded with another professional named Falks. And this really was an inclusive and international group psychotherapy organization that remains pretty active today. This was just a year before Moreno's death in 1974. After Moreno's death, it seems that Zirka Moreno really came in as a leader in the psychodrama community, although she already had been publishing about psychodrama, refining Moreno's ideas, helping to translate his books from German into English, and really contributing in a major way to the development, teaching, and practice of psychodrama. But even more so after Jacob Moreno died. Many people lovingly refer to her as the mother of psychodrama. Within a year of Moreno's death, the American Board of Examiners in Sociometry, Psychodrama, and Group Psychotherapy was created to formalize and standardize the way that psychodramatists were being certified. After Moreno's death, there seems to be a significant increase in psychodrama's presence and popularity internationally, while psychodrama seemed to have decreased significantly in the United States. And there seems to have been many different complex reasons for this decrease in the United States. Some of it could be related to the decrease in group work and group therapy education particularly within social work programs in the United States. Some of it could be related to the negative reputation that psychodrama had developed in certain circles in the United States. Some of it was related to the evidence-based practice movements that really emphasized the importance of being able to demonstrate through quantitative research the effectiveness of our methods, which the psychodrama community, at least in the United States, has really failed to do until more recently. Some of it could be related to the culture. The United States having a more individualistic culture, more medicalized approach to mental health that psychodrama really challenges primarily as a group modality and as a non-pathologizing way of considering mental illness. And some of it is probably related to Moreno's personality, the enemies that he created through his constant critiques of psychoanalysis, of psychoanalytic approaches, through his controversial personality. He acknowledges this himself, even describing himself as a megalomaniac at times. And sometimes unethical behaviors, unethical by today's standards and unethical by the standards back then in some ways as well. So it seems that all of this, and perhaps other reasons, contributed to the decline of psychodrama in the United States. It was also during this time that the IAGP went from being one of the only group therapy associations and the only creative arts therapy association, and throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, just about every field, counseling, social work, psychology, all started to create their own specialized divisions of group psychotherapy, group specialists, group work, and group approaches, which pulled from IAGP's membership, as well as all the creative arts therapies and expressive arts therapies, which differentiated, forming their own organizations in this time period as well. So all of the creative arts therapists that were going to IAGP now had their own professional homes, which probably also contributed to the decline in psychodrama. Psychodrama, because there wasn't enough research, and probably because of the personality types of psychodramatists, leaning more towards action-based, intuitive, extroverted, less interested in research and academia, This probably contributed to the decline and absence of psychodrama in American academia, whereas other approaches really gained footing within academia, drama therapy, for example. This seems to be slightly changing now, though in comparison internationally in other countries, psychodrama really integrated within academia and within university systems. In different countries, you can get a PhD and a master's degree in psychodrama, whereas in the United States, it can be hard to even find an elective in psychodrama. The good news is that there seems to be an increase in interest in psychodrama in the United States in the past 10 years or so. In 2014 particularly, from what I can tell, there seems to be a big uptick in psychodrama book publications. An increase in publications, and an increase in publications by the Psychodrama Journal as well, which went out of print for a few years. In 2016, Zircon Moreno dies at the age of 99. And from what I heard from some of my trainers at the time, some people had a fear that psychodrama might die with Zirka, which does not seem to be the case. Psychodrama seems to be more popular today than it was in 2015, 2016. In 2019, the American Board of Examiners in Psychodrama actually had a record number of applications for certification. So this is a pretty objective measure of the increased interest in psychodrama. Some other objective measures of its increase in interest include that there's a new psychodrama book series published by Springer Nature, which is actually the book series that my book takes place in. And so this is the first time there's ever been a book series on psychodrama. And this was a book series initiated by the publisher, which suggests that there's increased interest in academia in psychodrama. The Social Work with Groups Journal in 2020-2021 actually did their first ever special edition journal publication on psychodrama. There seems to be new university courses that were created in psychodrama, particularly in the social work education field in the past 3 years, including the course that I teach at Bryn Mawr College, a course that Sari Skolnick teaches at Yeshiva University, and a newer course that Leticia Nieto teaches at University of Washington. So there seems to be an increased interest in psychodrama in the United States, and my hope is that my newly published book might help contribute to an increased interest in psychodrama, particularly by social workers, and help us to integrate psychodrama within academia and within social work education. So this is just a brief overview of the history of Moreno's methods, of psychodrama, of sociometry. Of course, there's a lot more that could be said about the history. If you wanted to learn more, I would suggest that you check out Chapter 3 in my book. And there's also other videos and other resources referenced in the book in Chapter 3 that you might consider looking into if you wanted to develop a comprehensive understanding of Morenian history. I always suggest reading Zirka's memoir, reading Jacob Moreno's autobiography of a genius, and also reading Jonathan Moreno's book, Impromptu Man, which does a really good job of exploring the details of the history of Moreno's methods, particularly as it related to the culture and other movements within the culture throughout Moreno's life. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, I would love to hear either in the comments or if you wanted to write to me directly about how the video was helpful for you. And stay posted for additional videos coming about psychodrama history, psychodrama philosophy, and psychodrama in general.